The Duke of Ashbourne had brought his mistress into the heart of his house, dressed her in pearls, and let her laugh at the wife whose dowry had saved him. Before 182 guests, Lady Seraphina Vale called Duchess Elinor a decorative wife, pretty enough for the wall and useless everywhere else. The room laughed because the Duke did not stop it. This is a story of broken vows, quiet rebellion, and a woman who learned that silence could be sharpened into a blade. The ballroom smelled of beeswax, orange peel, damp wool, and the faint iron scent of snow melting from carriage wheels in the stone entry below. Cold seeped through the soles of Elinor's satin slippers and climbed her bones, as if Ashbourne Hall itself had decided she did not belong inside its warmed rooms. The diamonds at her throat rested like ice against her skin, and the silk of her pale blue gown, chosen for her by the Duke's own aunt, scratched at the bend of her elbows where the lace had been mended twice. No one saw the mend. That had always been Elinor's talent. The chandeliers burned with 300 candles, enough to turn the painted ceiling gold and set every glass in the room glittering. Fiddles played from the musicians' gallery. Footmen moved in a white-gloved procession with trays of ratafia and negus. Ladies rustled in watered silk. Gentlemen stood in small knots beneath portraits of dead Ashbourne men who had wasted fortunes, broken horses, married heiresses, and been praised for all three. Elinor stood beneath the largest of those portraits, her gloved hands folded over a small silver-clasped ledger no one had yet noticed. Across the room, her husband laughed. Lucian Markham, Duke of Ashbourne, had a laugh that carried easily. It had once startled Elinor on the morning after their wedding, when she had found him in the fort breakfast room, with a newspaper in one hand and a bruised plum in the other. She had thought then that such a laugh must belong to a man capable of warmth. She had been 19, newly duchessed, and too tired from the wedding journey to understand the difference between warmth and charm. He had married her in a small London chapel, because her father's mills had made enough money to rescue Ashbourne lands from creditors. The bargain had been dressed in orange blossoms, white satin, and a settlement written in a solicitor's hand so tight it looked strangled. Her father had gained a title for his only daughter. Ashbourne had gained enough capital to keep the roof upon his ancestral pride. Elinor had gained a name that opened every door except the one to her husband's regard. "Your Grace," murmured Mr. Belgrave, the steward, as he passed near her with a bow too quick to be comfortable. "The upper rooms are holding heat tolerably well, I trust." "The upper rooms are not where the children sleep," Elinor said. He blinked. "Your Grace?" "The undermaids. I saw frost inside their dormer window this morning." Pritchard's face twitched, and his gaze slipped to the ledger beneath her hand. "I shall speak to the housekeeper. You shall speak to me first." He bowed again, lower this time, then vanished into the moving crowd. Elinor watched him go. She had learned, in 11 months of marriage, that servants vanished only when they feared the truth had feet. A ripple of laughter rose near the fireplace. Lady Seraphina Vale stood there, holding court beneath a garland of holly and laurel. She wore dark green velvet, cut daringly low for a country assembly, and an emerald pendant that rested upon her breast like a reptile's eye. Her hair was arranged in glossy coils, with one deliberate curl at her white shoulder. She was not young enough to be harmless, nor old enough to be ignored, and she had cultivated both facts into an art. The Duke stood beside her, not too near, never too near. That was his cruelty. He had never given Elinor the mercy of vulgar proof. He had only placed Seraphina at his table, lent her his horses, paid her milliner, and allowed society to do the arithmetic aloud. "Ah," Seraphina said, her voice ringing sweetly above the music as Elinor approached. "Here comes her Grace at last." I feared she had mistaken the linen closet for the drawing-room again. A few women hid smiles behind fans. Lord Evington coughed into his fist. The Duke's expression altered by a fraction, not enough to defend his wife, only enough to show he had heard. Elinor stopped with the perfect distance between insult and reply. "Lady Seraphina," she said. "Duchess." Seraphina dipped the smallest curtsy ever offered beneath a ducal roof. "How charming you look. So pale, so still. One begins to understand why Ashbourne chose you." The Duke glanced into his glass. Elinor looked at him. Only once. The musicians drew out the last notes of a country dance. Conversations gathered close, as they always did when cruelty wore jewels. Somewhere near the windows, a pane rattled in the wind, Snow pressed against the dark glass like a face trying to look in. Serafina lifted her fan. It was painted with tiny violets, though the season had long killed every violet in the county. Do forgive me," she continued. "I have been explaining to Lady Morton that a great house requires all sorts of useful objects. A decanter for wine, a candelabrum for light, a duchess for display." The laughter came at once, nervous at first, then fuller when Serafina smiled. The Duke did not move. Elinor's face stayed still. Serafina turned her head slightly, allowing the emerald to catch candlelight. "Truly, Your Grace, you are the prettiest chair in Ashbourne Hall, a pretty chair no one meant to sit in." There were 182 guests in that ballroom. Elinor knew because she had checked every name against Cook's accounts, every accepted invitation against the number of pheasants ordered, every bottle of claret against the cellar book. 182 people breathed, blinked, and waited to see whether the mill owner's daughter would forget she was a duchess. Elinor felt the ledger's silver clasp press into her palm through the kid leather of her glove. Her mother had once told her that humiliation had a sound, not a cry, not a sob, a small inward closing, like a door being latched by someone who meant never to open it again. Elinor heard that latch inside herself. Then she smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It did not ask permission from the room. "How fortunate," she said, "that Ashbourne Hall is so full of things no one uses properly." The laughter faltered. The Duke looked up. Serafina's fan paused halfway through its flutter. "I beg your pardon? Do you?" Elinor asked. The words were soft enough to pass for innocence, and sharp enough to draw blood from anyone. Listening carefully, Ashbourne took one step forward. "Elinor." It was the first time he had said her name that evening. She turned to him. His black evening coat fit him without mercy, broad at the shoulder, narrow at the waist, every inch the nobleman portraits had promised him he was. His eyes were grey, and there had been mornings at the start when Elinor had imagined kindness, sleeping somewhere in them, buried but not dead. Now she saw something else there, alarm, not for her, not yet, for himself. "Your Grace?" she said. The title struck him more cleanly than his name could have done. He lowered his voice. "This is hardly the place." "No," Elinor said. "It rarely is." Serafina laughed again, but the sound had lost its silk. "How cryptic. Has marriage made you a philosopher, Duchess?" "No," Elinor answered. "Accounts have." At that, Pritchard stopped near the punch bowl. A footman's tray dipped, and two glasses trembled against one another with a faint, bright chime. Serafina's gaze dropped. At last, she saw the silver-clasped ledger beneath Elinor's hand. The emerald at her throat rose and fell once. Elinor noticed. So did the Duke. For nearly a year, Ashbourne Hall had treated its Duchess as an ornament placed in the correct room and dusted when necessary. It had fed her with polite contempt, dressed her in family jewels, and sent her to bed alone in chambers where the fire was always laid too late and burned too low. It had taught her that a wife might be bought without being kept, named without being chosen, and bowed to without being seen. But before dawn, a key would be placed in her hand, and every locked drawer in Ashbourne Hall would begin to speak. For the moment, Elinor merely closed her fingers over the ledger. "What is that?" Serafina asked. "A household book," Elinor said. "Since when does your Grace trouble herself with household books?" Elinor looked past her, to the Duke, then to Mr. Pritchard, then to the row of footmen standing rigid along the wall in coats brushed thin at the cuffs. "Since the household began bleeding," she said. No one laughed then, not even the mistress. The key was colder than the corridor. Elinor held it in her bare hand beneath the fold of her shawl as she crossed the servants' portage before dawn, its iron teeth biting into the soft flesh of her palm. The house had not yet awakened to its own grandeur. No violins, no laughter, no emeralds flashing at candlelight, only the sour smell of spent tallow, old stones sweating in the winter damp, and the far-off scrape of a scullery maid drawing ash from a grate. Mrs. Harker walked 3 steps ahead, with a lantern held low. "Mind the 3rd flagstone, Your Grace," the housekeeper whispered. "It rocks in the wet." Elinor lifted her hem and stepped over it. "How long has it rocked?" "Since before my knees began telling the weather." "And why was it never repaired?" Mrs. Harker did not look back. "The order was put in." "By whom?" "Mr. Pritchard." "And paid." The housekeeper stopped before a narrow oak door at the end of the passage. There was no answer in her face, only the tight, careful look of a servant who had watched too much and survived by saying little. Elinor fitted the key into the lock. It resisted her at first, as if the room itself objected to a duchess entering by right rather than invitation. Then the mechanism gave with a dry iron cough, and the door opened upon dust, ink, cold leather, and secrets that had been shut up too long. The estate office was smaller than she expected. Ashbourne Hall had acres of marble and rooms large enough for vanity to echo in, yet the chamber that governed its tenants, wages, coal, cattle, timber, rents, repairs, and ruin, was no larger than a modest dressing room. Ledgers lined the shelves, pigeonholes bulged with folded accounts tied in faded tape. A great desk stood near the window, its surface scarred by penknives and candle burns. The hearth was laid but unlit. "Who uses this room?" Elinor asked. "Mr. Pritchard, mostly. His lordship's man of business when he comes from London. His Grace signs what is brought to him in the library. Without reading, Mrs. Harker's mouth moved once before she answered. "I would not presume to know his Grace's habits." Elinor crossed to the desk and drew one finger through the dust gathered along its edge. The mark she left behind was clean and pale. "He has not sat here in months," she said. "No, Your Grace." There it was. Not accusation. Worse. Confirmation. Elinor set the silver-clasped household book beside the larger estate ledgers and untied the first bundle, coal accounts. Her fingers were stiff from cold, but she turned each paper slowly, pressing them flat beneath the lantern glow. The figures had the dull harmlessness of numbers until they began to contradict one another. 20 tons of coal ordered for the servants' wing, 10 delivered, 20 paid. She took up the next receipt. Kitchen coal, stable coal, nursery coal for rooms that held no children, coal for 2 closed cottages near the North Meadow. Every line wore the neat black signature of Mr. Pritchard beneath the supplier's mark. Every sum was larger than it ought to have been. Every delivery was smaller. From the wall, something tapped twice. Elinor stilled. Mrs. Harker turned her head toward the adjoining passage. "A pipe," she said too quickly. "The old ones knock in the cold." Elinor laid one hand over the papers. At this hour, a pause followed. Then the house settled again with a long creak above them. There were 7 hours before the Duke returned from the shooting breakfast at Lord Morton's lodge. 7 hours before Ashbourne Hall put on its polished face again. On the corner of the desk lay a letter sealed in red wax, addressed to Mr. Pritchard in a hand Elinor did not know. It had not been opened, but a black mark beside the seal showed it had been delivered by a debt agent, not a friend. She left it untouched. "For now, why next?" Elinor said. Mrs. Harker drew a breath. "Your Grace, perhaps Mr. Pritchard should be present for the cellar books. If Mr. Pritchard had wished to explain them, he would have invited me long ago." The wine ledger was heavier, bound in cracked brown calf, with the Ashbourne crest stamped on the front. Elinor opened it and found neat columns of claret, port, Madeira, sherry, champagne, bottles withdrawn for dinners that had not happened, cases sent to London during weeks when the Duke had been at Ashbourne, French brandy marked for household medicinal use, though the still-room cupboards had been so bare that cook had soaked toothache rags in gin. Elinor turned another page. There, among the entries for candles and preserves, appeared a repeated notation, S.V. At first it meant nothing. Then she saw it again beside 6 yards of lion's silk, again beside pearl buttons, again beside imported scent from Bond Street. S.V. Seraphina Vale. Not written as a lady's name, not even written as a guest, hidden like a stain beneath initials, folded into household expense as if the Duke's mistress were a leaking roof or a broken pump. Mrs. Harker moved closer. Her lantern trembled, throwing the letters into a wavering shadow. "Does His Grace know?" Elinor asked. The housekeeper lowered her eyes. "I've never heard him ask. That was not my question." "No, Your Grace." Elinor closed the wine ledger softly. The house was not poor. It was being robbed. The sentence did not pass her lips, but it hardened her spine. The cold in the room altered. It no longer seemed to enter her. It seemed to gather behind her. She opened the tenant rent book next. This one was older, its pages thick and faintly rippled from damp. The rents were entered according to quarter days. Lady Day and Michaelmas marked in careful red ink, as they had been for generations. Elinor's father had once told her that great families loved old customs best, when those customs delivered money on time. A tenant might have 6 hungry children and a dead cow, yet the quarter day came with the same solemn appetite as death. Here, the red marks were crossed and amended. Paid rents vanished from one page and appeared as arrears on another. Widow Crane of Northfield Cottage, marked unpaid for 2 quarters. Elinor remembered the woman's cracked hands offering curtsies in the church porch. Mr. Bell's grazing rent marked overdue, though the stable boys had spoken of his son delivering geese only last week in lieu of coin. "Send for the rent receipts," Elinor said. Mrs. Harker hesitated. "They will be in Mr. Pritchard's strongbox." "Then send for the strongbox, Your Grace. He keeps the second key on his watch chain." Elinor looked at the lock plate beneath the desk, then at the drawers, then at the poker resting beside the unlit hearth. Mrs. Harker followed her gaze. For the first time that morning, the housekeeper almost smiled. "It may damage the wood," she said. "It has survived Ashbourne men for 200 years, Elinor replied. "It shall survive me." The first drawer gave after 3 blows. The sound cracked through the little room, blunt and shocking. Somewhere beyond the wall, a footstep retreated. Elinor did not chase it. Inside the drawer lay loose receipts, a broken stick of sealing wax, 3 unpaid wage lists, and a narrow packet tied with green ribbon. She drew out the wage lists first. Footmen, maids, grooms, laundrywomen, gardeners. Some had gone 8 weeks unpaid. Some had received half. Beside 3 names was written, "Dismissed for insolence." "Insolence," Elinor said. Mrs. Harker's face pinched around the mouth. "Asking for wages can sound insolent to a gentleman who has already spent them." The green ribbon packet was next. Elinor untied it and found promissory notes folded in careful halves. The first bore Seraphina's initials. The second bore the name of a London jeweller. The third concerned a loan secured against timber from the West Wood. Timber never felled and never sold. At the bottom of the 4th page, beneath a sum large enough to feed every unpaid servant through winter, was the Duke of Ashbourne's signature. Elinor stared at it until the ink seemed to rise from the paper. "That cannot be right, Mrs. Balin," Harker whispered. Elinor touched the signature once, lightly, as though it might bruise. She had seen her husband sign dinner cards, replies to invitations, hunting agreements, and the brief, courteous notes he sent when declining to dine with her. His hand was bold, impatient, unmistakably his. This signature was his, and the debt beside it was one he had never seen. By the time the first kitchen fire took hold, Elinor had learned that hunger had its own sound. It was not the growl of an empty stomach, nor the crackle of thin soup over the range. It was the careful silence of servants who stopped speaking when a duchess entered, because speaking had cost others their places. It was the soft scrape of cook's knife over a bone already boiled twice. It was the hollow clink of the coal scuttle when the last black lumps were tipped into the grate, and no one dared ask when more would come. Elinor came down the back stairs with the wage lists folded inside her shawl and the silver ledger pressed beneath her arm. Mrs. Harker followed close behind, her cap strings trembling from the pace. The kitchen, vast and low-ceilinged, lay in a grey light of steam and ash. Copper pans hung above the dresser like dull shields. A boy with red wrists turned a spit before a fire too small for the room, while 2 maids stood over a table scraping carrots so thinly the peel looked thicker than the flesh. Every hand stopped. Cook, a square woman with flour on her forearm and a face burned pink from years of ovens, dipped a curtsy. "Your Grace, do not stop working," Elinor said. "The house has taken enough from your time." No one moved at first. Then Cook set her knife down with a small, decisive sound. "Molly," she said, "put the water back to boil." The girl obeyed. The room breathed again, but not easily. Elinor unfolded the wage list and laid it upon the scrubbed table among the carrots. "Who among you has been paid late?" No one answered. She looked at the spit boy's chapped hands, at the maid's frayed apron ties, at Cook's cuffs turned back to hide worn edges. "I am not asking Mr. Pritchard's question," she said. "I am asking mine." Cook wiped both hands on her apron. 3 weeks late in November, 4 in December. A laundry maid near the copper swallowed. 6 for me, Your Grace. My brother was turned off, said the spit boy, voice cracking. for asking his wages before Michaelmas. Mrs. Harker's jaw tightened. Elinor placed a finger beside the word insolence on the list. His name? Thomas Reed, Your Grace. She wrote it down. The act changed the room. It was only ink on paper, yet heads lifted. Molly leaned forward. Cook's hands stopped hiding in her apron. The spit boy stared at the quill as if it had become a weapon. A house that robbed its servants had already confessed its ruin. Elinor looked up. Who gave the order to dismiss him? Mr. Pritchard carried it, Cook said. But the note came from the library. The Duke's library. Cook's lips pressed together. Elinor did not force her. Not yet. She turned the page. And while wages were delayed, what was delivered for Lady Seraphina Vale? This time the silence sharpened. From the scullery came a soft clang, then a hurried whisper. Someone had been listening beyond the door. Mrs. Harker crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and opened it. The passage outside stood empty, though a wet footprint marked the stone. Elinor folded the wage list. How many doors lead from there? 3, Your Grace, Mrs. Harker said. 1 to the still room, 1 to the yard, 1 to the servants' stair. A question remained in the cold air with the steam. Who had run, and who had sent them? Cook answered before Elinor asked again. Silk came in October, green, from London. 2 dress lengths, then pearls to be reset, then sent from France in a blue bottle, though the parcel was marked lavender water for the linen press. French scent? Elinor asked. Yes, Your Grace. Orange flower and something bitter beneath it. You could smell it through the paper. Elinor remembered that smell from the ballroom, Seraphina's velvet sleeve passing too near. Sweet at first, then sharp enough to cling to the throat. She wrote that down too. From the kitchen, Elinor went to the linen room, where the air was colder and smelled of soap, starch and damp cotton that had not dried properly. Shelves rose to the ceiling, but several stood half empty. A maid named Bess showed her sheets darned so many times the patches overlapped like poor fields on a map. These were meant for the east guest rooms, Bess whispered. Mrs. Harker ordered New Holland cloth last spring, and it never came. It came. Bess drew open a lower drawer. Inside lay a scrap of fine linen, cut cleanly from the bolt. A piece was left behind. The rest went away in Lady Seraphina's trunks after the July races. Mrs. Harker made a low sound, almost a groan. Elinor touched the scrap. It was smooth, strong, expensive. Her father had once made his first fortune not in silk, but in mill cloth sold by the yard to families who counted every inch. He had taught her that fabric never lied. Thread showed quality, cut showed purpose, waste showed character. Keep that scrap, Elinor said. Not in this room. Bess looked frightened. Where, Your Grace? With me. The servants' passages came next. Narrow, twisting, and meanly lit, they ran behind the grand rooms like veins hidden beneath painted skin. The walls sweated with cold. In one dormer chamber, frost feathered the inside of the glass, and 2 maids had pinned an old shawl over a crack in the frame. In another, 3 footmen shared blankets thin enough to show the stripe of the mattress beneath. Elinor stood in the doorway, her breath turning white before her lips. One of the footmen tried to rise, bare feet hitting the boards. Stay where you are, she said. He froze, ashamed of his own poverty. She took off her shawl and laid it over the nearest bed. Who ordered coal withheld from these rooms? No one spoke. Then the youngest footman said, We were told the family apartments came first. And did the family apartments freeze? His eyes flicked to Mrs. Harker. No, Your Grace. Elinor, Taine's hand closed around the silver clasp of the ledger until it pressed a half-moon into her skin. By 10 o'clock, the house had begun to wake above them. Bells rang from bedrooms. Carriage wheels ground over the frozen sweep outside. Somewhere a door closed too hard, and every servant near Elinor flinched. Mr. Pritchard has returned from the home farm, Mrs. Harker murmured. Then we shall save him a journey. They found him in the estate office, standing beside the broken drawer. He had his watch in one hand, and his face arranged in injured dignity, but the pulse at his temple beat visibly. Your Grace, he said, this is a most irregular proceeding. So are unpaid wages. His gaze dropped to the papers in her hand. Those matters are complex. Then simplify them. Pritchard glanced at Mrs. Parker. Perhaps her Grace would permit a private explanation. No, Elinor said. Those who suffered the accounts may hear how they were made. His nostrils flared. You do not understand what you are touching. I understand coal bought and not delivered, wine paid for and not cellared, rents marked unpaid after they were collected, linen removed from the household, wages withheld while Lady Seraphina ordered silk, pearls, and French scent under initials. Shall I continue? Pritchard's injured dignity began to peel away. Beneath it lay something harder. You think this concerns a mistress, he said quietly. It concerns the Duke's credit. His Grace's paper is already whispered over in London. If these accounts leave this room, creditors will come like crows. Tenants will hear. Trustees will ask why household funds and settlement monies crossed hands. Elinor held still. Settlement monies. Under the law of coverture, a wife's property could be swallowed by her husband unless tied up by careful trustees. Her father had insisted on such protection. She remembered the solicitor's dry voice explaining that even a duchess might need saving from her own marriage. Pritchard saw that she understood. Yes, he said, now you begin to see. Expose the theft and you may expose the settlement. Expose the settlement and you may expose his Grace. Ashbourne may lose more than money. He stepped closer and lowered his voice until it became almost kind. He may lose his name. Elinor looked down at the Duke's signature beside the debt he had never seen, then at the listening doorway where servants had gathered in a silent line. At last, she folded the paper once. Then it seems, she said, that Ashbourne Hall has been surviving on borrowed honour. By noon, the smell of French orange blossom had reached the servants' stairs. It came before Lady Seraphina Vale did, sweet and bitter, drifting through the passage like a warning laid upon the air. Elinor stood in the estate office with the silver ledger open before her, and 3 columns of figures copied in her own hand. Coal, wages, linen. Beside each sum, she had marked the page from which it had been taken, the witness who could speak to it, and the name of the person who would suffer if the proof vanished. Mrs. Harker stood by the door, listening. She is in the blue drawing-room, the housekeeper said, with Lady Morton and Mrs. Bellamy. Elinor dipped her pen, wiped the excess ink against the bottle's lip, and continued writing. How long has she been there? Long enough to ask whether her Grace has taken a fancy to sums. The pen did not pause. And what answer did she receive? That her Grace has many talents. From whom? Mrs. Harker's mouth tightened. From no one, Your Grace. Elinor looked up then. Silence had changed sides in the house. Before that morning, it had belonged to those who wished to keep her small. Now it belonged to those watching to see what she would do with what she knew. A laugh floated faintly from above, too bright for the winter-darkened hall. Elinor sanded the page, waited until the ink dulled, and closed the ledger. Leave the door open. Mrs. Harker blinked. Your Grace, if Lady Seraphina has come to see whether I am ashamed of the estate office, let her not waste the walk. The housekeeper's face gave the smallest break of approval. She opened the door wider. Elinor returned to the desk. The broken drawer still gaped under the scars left by the poker. Mr. Pritchard had not returned to remove the papers, though he had sent 3 messages asking whether her Grace required assistance. Each message had been written in a smaller hand than the last. Beside the inkstand lay the red waxed letter that had been delivered to him by a debt agent. It remained unopened. Elinor placed it beneath the brass paperweight shaped like a hound and left it there. Not yet. A quarter-hour later, a maid arrived with cheeks pink from hurry and curtsied so low she nearly dropped the tray. Begging your pardon, Your Grace. Tea in the blue drawing-room, by Lady Seraphina's request. She asks whether Your Grace means to join the ladies, or whether the accounts have swallowed you entirely. Elinor rose, smoothing the front of her plain morning gown. It was grey wool, warm and unadorned, more suitable to a steward's wife than a duchess receiving county ladies. She did not change it. Tell Lady Seraphina I shall join her presently. The maid glanced at the ledger, then at Elinor's ink-stained finger. Yes, Your Grace. When Elinor entered the blue drawing-room, Lady Morton and Mrs. Bellamy turned, as if a bell had been rung. Seraphina sat near the hearth, in a rose silk gown that belonged to April rather than January. A strand of pearls circled her throat. The firelight softened her face and sharpened her smile. Duchess, she said, how industrious you have become. Elinor crossed to the tea table. The china was Sèvres, painted with pale birds. One saucer had a crack beneath the glaze. How generous of you to notice, Elinor said. Lady Morton looked between them with the delighted discomfort of a woman who would repeat, everything while pretending reluctance. Serafina poured tea without asking how Elinor took it. We were only saying how difficult it must be for a lady to understand estate business, all those ledgers, all those rents. Men spend years learning such things, do they? Elinor accepted the cup. Mrs. Bellamy gave a nervous smile. My dear Duchess, nobody expects you to trouble yourself with tenants and timber. A lady's influence is gentler. A starving servant does not eat gentleness, Elinor said. The cup stopped halfway to Lady Morton's lips. Serafina's fingers tightened around the teapot handle. Then she laughed, light and silver. How grave. One might think Ashbourne Hall was a parish workhouse. One might, Elinor replied, if one had seen the servants' dormers. Serafina set down the pot with a click. Take care, Duchess. There is a difference between compassion and meddling. And who taught you the difference? The room cooled at once. Serafina's eyes narrowed, but only for a moment. She recovered with the ease of a woman who had survived by making her cruelty look like grace. I fear you mistake me, she said. I only worry for you, a young wife, unaccustomed to a house of this size, poring through books, questioning servants, breaking drawers. People will say you have been driven to odd habits by neglect. Lady Morton's fan rose at once to hide her mouth. There it was, not a slap, a ribbon drawn tight around the throat. Elinor placed her untouched tea upon the table. The spoon trembled once against the saucer, then stilled. People may say what they can afford to prove. Serafina's smile thinned. Proof is such a merchant's word. My father liked it. Your father sold cloth. And Ashbourne bought survival with it. Mrs. Bellamy looked down. Lady Morton's fan ceased moving. Serafina rose. Pearls shone against her throat. Each one no doubt entered somewhere under false initials. How spirited you are today. It quite suits you. Though I confess, I preferred you as you were. Elinor met her gaze. Useful objects often do. For a heartbeat, Serafina did not understand. Then colour touched the tops of her cheekbones. The door opened, and Mr. Pritchard appeared with a salver in hand. His bow was stiff. For Lady Serafina, he crossed the room and presented a folded paper sealed with pale green wax. Serafina took it quickly, but not before Elinor saw the black printed heading at the top of the inner page. Ashbourne County Benevolent Society. A subscription dinner. Serafina slipped the paper under her glove. How tiresome. Charitable business never rests. Charitable? Elinor asked. Oh yes. I have decided the county must not languish in gloom merely because winter has been severe. Serafina turned to Lady Morton and Mrs. Pewin, her voice warming into performance. A dinner at Ashbourne Hall, blankets for the poor, soup subscriptions for the village. Every important family will be invited. His Grace will approve, of course. Lady Morton brightened. How admirable. Mrs. Bellamy nodded. And so necessary after the frost. Elinor looked at Pritchard. His face had gone grey around the mouth. A small custom of county charity was that every subscription would be printed afterward, name and sum, in the local paper. Generosity became record. Record became reputation. Reputation, if falsified, became a blade. Serafina lifted her chin. You must attend, Duchess. It will do people good to see that you are not always hidden among papers you cannot read. Elinor picked up her gloves from the tea table and drew them on slowly, finger by finger. When is this dinner? Friday. 3 days. Pritchard's gaze flicked once toward the floor. Elinor saw it. Serafina saw Elinor see it. The red-waxed letter in the estate office waited unopened beneath the brass hound. The Duke would return before nightfall. And now Lady Serafina Vale had invited the county to dine upon money that was not hers. Elinor inclined her head. Then I shall look forward to seeing exactly who pays for charity at Ashbourne Hall. The library smelled of leather, cold smoke, and wet wool from the Duke's riding coat. Ashbourne stood before the hearth with his back to the fire, mud still drying along the hem of his boots. He had not changed after returning from Lord Morton's lodge. His gloves lay on the table, one finger turned inside out, as though he had stripped them off in anger. Beside them, unopened beneath the brass hound, rested the red-waxed letter addressed to Mr. Pritchard. Elinor noticed his eyes move to it before he looked at her. Is there a reason, he said, that Lady Morton has sent word asking whether my Duchess has taken charge of the county poor, the cellar, the servants' wages, and my private accounts before luncheon? Elinor stood near the long table, with the silver-clasped ledger in her hands. The windows behind her were darkening toward afternoon, and the glass showed her reflection, as pale and straight-backed as a figure cut from paper. "There is," she said. Ashbourne's jaw hardened. "Then give it to me plainly. Your servants have not been paid. That is Pritchard's concern. Your tenants have been marked in arrears after paying rent. Then Pritchard shall correct it. Your coal bills show 20 tons paid for and 10 delivered." His mouth opened, then closed. Elinor stepped nearer the table and laid down 3 sheets. "Your mistress's silk, pearls, scent, and linen have been hidden under household expenses." Ashbourne's hand struck the mantel hard enough to stir ash in the grate. "Do not use that word. Which word displeases you, your grace? Mistress or hidden?" He turned on her then, fully, for the first time since their marriage. His gaze did not slide past her as if she were part of the furniture. It met her like a door forced open. "You will not drag my name through servant gossip because Seraphina wounded your pride." Elinor looked at the mud on his boots, at the hands that had signed invitations and debts with equal carelessness, at the man who knew how to command a horse, a table, a room, yet did not know whether the people beneath his roof had eaten. "My pride?" she asked. His nostrils flared. "You broke open a drawer. I found unpaid wages inside it. You questioned maids. They answered. You allowed Lady Seraphina to be insulted in my own drawing room." Elinor's fingers curled once around the edge of the ledger, then released. "No, I allowed her to be understood." The clock on the mantel ticked between them. Friday's charity dinner lay 3 days away, already galloping toward them with every name Seraphina had invited. On the table, the red waxed letter waited, its seal dark as dried blood. Elinor had not yet opened it. Neither had he. Ashbourne glanced at it again. "Why is that here?" he asked. "Because Mr. Pritchard feared it enough to leave it unopened. You had no right to seize his correspondence. I had no right to my own rooms either, it seems. Yet I was placed in them and told to be grateful." His face changed by a degree. Not remorse. Not yet. Something less comfortable. Recognition. He looked away first. Elinor drew one folded list from the ledger and held it out. Thomas Reed was dismissed for asking wages before Michaelmas. Molly in the kitchen has gone 6 weeks unpaid. The footmen sleep under frost. Cook boils bones twice. And Lady Seraphina intends to host charity before the entire county, with money that may belong to those same people. She is raising funds. She is raising admiration. That is enough, he said. "No," Elinor answered. The word landed harder than a shout. Ashbourne stared at her as if the chair had spoken, as if the ornament had stepped down from its wall and taken the family sword with it. Elinor's voice lowered. "Tell me, your grace, does your pride matter more than your people eating?" He moved toward her, not fast, not threatening, but with the old certainty of a man who had always expected space to yield before him. Elinor did not step back. His gaze fell to the ledger, then to her ink-stained fingers. "You think yourself very brave because a few servants have begun whispering in your favor. I think hunger is louder than whispers." Before he could answer, 3 sharp knocks struck the library door. Ashbourne snapped his head toward it. Not now. The door opened anyway. Burton, the butler, stood on the threshold, white-faced and rigid. Behind him waited a man in a dark travelling coat, hat in hand, damp snow melting on his shoulders. He carried a folded notice, sealed not in red wax, but with black ribbon and the stamped authority of the county bailiff. Burton swallowed. "Forgive me, your grace. The gentleman says the matter cannot wait." Ashbourne's face emptied of colour. The man stepped forward and bowed. "His grace, the Duke of Ashbourne?" Ashbourne did not answer. The bailiff placed the notice upon the library table, directly beside Elinor's silver ledger. "At the request of the creditor," he said, "and under seal bearing your grace's own mark, I am instructed to serve notice upon Ashbourne Hall." Elinor looked down. There, pressed into the wax, was the Duke's seal, and beside it, written in a clerk's hard black hand, was a debt Ashbourne had sworn he had never seen. The black ribbon around the notice left a smear on Elinor's glove, as if the paper itself had been handled by soot. Ashbourne took it before she could, but his fingers did not behave like a duke's fingers. They fumbled once at the fold. The bailiff stood with his hat against his chest, eyes lowered to the carpet, boots leaving 2 wet marks upon the polished floor. Burton remained by the door, rigid with the strain of appearing death. Elinor watched her husband read, his face altered line by line. What creditor? He said. The bailiff cleared his throat. Messrs. Vale and Brackley, your grace, against advances secured upon winter grain, household wage allotments, and a portion of income assigned under the Duchess's marriage settlement. The room seemed to shrink around that last phrase. Ashbourne looked up. That is impossible. Elinor held out her hand. May I? For a moment he did not give it to her. Pride held the paper in his grip longer than sense. Then his thumb loosened, and the notice passed into her keeping. The language was legal, stiff, and merciless. The debt was due within 2 days. If unpaid, goods might be seized. Not the land itself, not yet, for entailed estates could not be devoured so easily, but plate, horses, wine, timber, already marked, and any movable property claimed against the obligation. Elinor's father had once explained that an entail protected a title's bones while leaving its flesh to be picked clean. She read the line again. Income assigned under the Duchess's marriage settlement. My settlement is held by trustees, she said. The bailiff inclined his head. So the creditor states, your grace. The advance was made upon an undertaking that the quarterly income would be directed through his grace's authority. Ashbourne struck the table with his fist. I gave no such undertaking. The bailiff's eyes moved, unwillingly, to the seal pressed into black wax. Elinor stepped nearer the window, where the light, though grey, was stronger. The impression showed the Ashbourne crest, the stag, the crown, the motto beneath. But one edge had blurred. Wax had pooled unevenly near the antlers, as though the seal had been pressed by a hand unused to its weight. Where was this executed? She asked. In London, your grace. When? 3 weeks after Michaelmas. Ashbourne turned sharply. I was at Ashbourne 3 weeks after Michaelmas. Yes, Elinor said, without looking at him. You dined with Lady Morton on the Thursday. You sent me your regrets on the Friday. And on the Saturday, Lady Seraphina left for London with 2 trunks. The silence that followed had teeth. Ashbourne's gaze fixed upon her. You remember that? I remember many things no one thought worth hiding. The bailiff shifted his hat. Forgive me, your grace, but I must ask whether payment is intended before Friday noon. Friday, the charity dinner, Seraphina's public triumph, set upon the very day the debt could bring bailiffs through the front door. Elinor folded the notice with care. You shall have an answer before then. That is not yours to promise, Ashbourne said. She looked at him. No, my settlement was named. His mouth tightened, but he said nothing. At the sideboard, the decanter trembled faintly as a carriage passed outside. Elinor glanced toward the window and saw, through the bare branches, Seraphina's curricle waiting near the side entrance, the groom stamping his feet against the cold. She had not left the house. She was waiting for news. Elinor turned back to the bailiff. Was there a witness to the undertaking? A clerk, your grace, and a lady acting as correspondent. A name? The bailiff hesitated. Ashbourne's voice cut through the room. Give it. Mrs. Selwyn, the man said, though the letters bore initials only. S. V. Ashbourne's hand closed slowly around the back of a chair. There was the knife, not in Seraphina's hand now, but laid bare upon the table for all of them to see. Elinor moved to the estate desk and opened the silver-clasped ledger. Her pulse beat in her wrist as she turned to the entries she had copied from the household. Accounts. S. V. Silk. S. V. Pearls. S. V. French scent. S. V. Linen. S. V. London journey after Michaelmas. She turned another page, then another. Her fingers stopped. A thin, torn edge remained near the binding, pale and ragged as a broken bone. The page that should have followed was gone. Mrs. Harker, standing just outside the threshold now, drew in a breath. Elinor touched the torn strip. The missing leaf would have carried the London payments, the dates, the initials, perhaps the witness that joined Seraphina Vale to Mrs. Selwyn and Mrs. Selwyn to the forged seal. Ashbourne stepped closer. What is it? Elinor looked from the torn ledger to the black-waxed notice, then to the window where Seraphina's carriage waited in the snow. At last, she said, someone has taken the only page that can hang her. The missing page returned with the smell of smoke upon it. Not at once. Not while the bailiff stood in the library with snow melting from his coat, nor while Ashbourne held the black-waxed notice as though it had burned through his hand. It came after the bailiff had been shown to the small parlour with a decanter he did not touch. and after Seraphina's curricle had rolled from the side entrance, its wheels cutting dark tracks through the thin snow. Elinor was still in the estate office, smoothing the torn edge of the ledger with the side of her thumb, when a small sound came from the passage. Not a knock, a breath caught too close to the door. Mrs. The harker turned first. "Who is there?" No one answered. Ashbourne, who had remained near the hearth with his coat unbuttoned and his face drawn tight, crossed the room in 2 strides and opened the door. A young maid stood beyond it, no older than 16, with a coal scuttle in her hands, and terror written into every inch of her bent shoulders. It was Molly from the kitchen. Her cap had slipped crooked, there was ash on her cheek, and on her right cuff, half hidden where the linen had frayed, was a crescent of black ink. Elinor saw it. Molly saw Elinor see it. The coal scuttle hit the floor with a hollow iron crash. "I didn't steal it," the girl whispered. "I swear before God, Your Grace, I didn't steal it." Ashbourne's voice cut too sharply. "Steal what?" Molly flinched so hard that Mrs. Pertida stepped between them. Elinor lifted one hand, not high, not hurried. "No one will strike you here." The girl's eyes darted to Ashbourne. Elinor corrected herself, softly and terribly. "No one." Ashbourne went still. Molly pressed both hands to her apron. Her fingers were raw from lye soap. One knuckle had split and dried dark at the edge. "She was in the still room after the assembly, Your Grace. Lady Seraphina. I'd gone to fetch peppermint water for Mrs. Bellamy's stomach. Mrs. Harker keeps it on the second shelf with the hartshorn and elderflower cordial." The small detail fixed the whole scene in place. Every great house kept a still room where women distilled remedies, cordials, rosewater, vinegar washes, and physic for every complaint gentlemen preferred not to name. It was a domestic kingdom, not a drawing room. Lady Seraphina had no reason to be there after midnight. Elinor's fingers closed around the torn ledger. What was she doing? She asked. Molly swallowed. Burning papers. The fire in the estate office gave a low collapse, ash settling under the grate. Ashbourne spoke more quietly. "You are certain?" Molly looked at him, then away. "I know her scent, Your Grace. Orange flowers, bitter-like." She had the silver knife from the fruit service, and she was scraping wax off a seal. There were papers in the flame already. One flew out when the door opened, and she cursed at me. Elinor stepped nearer. "What did you do?" "I picked it up after she left. It was burning at the corner. I thought," Molly's voice broke. She dug beneath her apron bib with shaking hands. "I thought if I gave it to Mr. Pritchard, he'd send me off like Thomas Reed. I thought if I kept it, someone might ask for it proper." She drew out a folded page wrapped in a strip of muslin. The edge was singed brown. A dark thumbprint stained the margin. Elinor took it and felt the paper tremble, though whether from Molly's hand or her own she could not have said. Ashbourne moved beside her. Together they read, S.V. London draft. Seal used. Settlement income pledged. County benevolent dinner to cover advance before Friday notice. Below it, in Mr. Pritchard's neat hand, were 3 sums. The expected subscriptions, the cost of the dinner charged to household expense, and the amount to be diverted before any blanket, soup, or coal reached the village poor. Molly wiped her nose with the back of her wrist, then caught herself, and dropped into a curtsy so low she almost stumbled. "I'm sorry, Your Grace. I should have brought it sooner." Elinor looked at the girl's ink-stained cuff, the cracked hands, the fear of dismissal still clinging to her like kitchen smoke. "No," she said. "You brought it alive." Ashbourne's eyes closed once, hard. When he opened them, he looked older. Elinor folded the page and placed it inside the silver ledger. Friday was no longer merely a dinner. It was the next theft, already written down. By Friday evening, Ashbourne Hall glittered like a house determined to lie beautifully. Every sconce had been polished until the candle flames doubled in the brass. The dining room smelled of roasted venison, hot butter, nutmeg, and the green sweetness of forced hothouse herbs cut at ruinous expense for a charitable table. Orange peel curled in silver bowls. The long mirrors caught the light and threw it back upon 182 guests, every face warmed by flame, every jewel awake, every whisper sharpened by the pleasure of coming scandal. Elinor entered last. She wore white, not bridal white, not innocent white, but the hard winter white of bone beneath snow. Ashbourne diamonds circled her throat, cold and bright against her skin, and her hair was pinned without ornament except for one plain silver comb. Beneath her left glove, hidden by the fold of her sleeve, rested the small silver-clasped ledger. The Duke stood at the head of the table, his face composed with such effort that the line beside his mouth had deepened. He had not spoken Seraphina's name to Elinor since Molly's confession. He had read the scorched page 3 times, then folded it with hands that would not keep steady. By dawn, a messenger had ridden to the trustees in London. By noon, a second had been sent to the creditor. By dusk, no answer had come. The bailiff had not gone. He waited at the Hare and Crown in the village with 2 men, a writ, and instructions to return if settlement was not made by morning. In such matters, a noble house was not safe because it was noble. A sheriff's officer could not seize entailed land, but he could mark plate, horses, clocks, mirrors, and wine. He could walk through a duke's rooms and turn dignity into an inventory. Elinor took her seat beside Ashbourne. Seraphina sat halfway down the table, exactly where she had arranged herself to be most visible. She wore emerald silk tonight, the same shade as her pendant, and white pearls threaded through her dark hair. Beside her plate lay a printed subscription card bearing the crest of the Ashbourne County Benevolent Society. Guests had already written sums beside their names: blankets for the poor, coal for widows, soup for children, money dressed as mercy waiting to be stolen. Dinner moved through its courses with the cruel patience of ceremony. Soup in deep silver tureens, fish with oyster sauce, venison with red currant, sweetbreads, jellies, game pie. The footmen served from the left and cleared from the right, their faces blank, cuffs brushed thin where fine livery failed to hide unpaid wages. Molly stood by the sideboard, pale but upright, holding a salver as if it were a shield. Elinor saw her. Molly saw that she had been seen. Across the table, Lady Morton whispered behind her fan. Mrs. Bellamy looked at Elinor's diamonds, then at Seraphina's pearls, and found the comparison more delicious than the dessert wine. At last, Seraphina rose. A hush travelled down the table, glass by glass, breath by breath. She lifted her champagne, as though the room had been waiting all evening for her hand to command. "It, my friends," she said, smiling with jewelled sweetness. "How moving it is to see such generosity gathered beneath Ashbourne's roof. His Grace has always understood duty, even when others in this house are only beginning to learn it." A few polite laughs stirred. Ashbourne's fingers closed around the stem of his glass. Seraphina turned her smile toward Elinor. "And so I must offer a toast to our dear Duchess, whose quiet presence reminds us that beauty need not burden itself with usefulness." Elinor held her gaze. Seraphina's smile brightened. "To the Duchess," she said, "whose only talent is wearing Ashbourne diamonds quietly." The room laughed. Less boldly than before, but it laughed. The old wound opened exactly where Seraphina meant it to. Elinor felt it, clean and cold, like a blade laid flat beneath the ribs. She heard a footman inhale too sharply. She saw Mrs. Harker standing near the door with one hand closed against her apron. She saw the Duke turn his head toward her, not with embarrassment this time, but with something close to dread. Elinor placed both palms on the table. She did not tremble. This time, the knife had a handle. She stood. Chair legs scraped. Conversation died. Seraphina remained standing, with her glass raised, though the wine inside had begun to quiver. Elinor drew the silver ledger from beneath her sleeve and walked the length of the table. No one stopped her. Not the Duke, not Pritchard, who stood near the service door with the grey look of a man watching earth open beneath his feet. Not Seraphina, whose jewelled smile faltered as Elinor came nearer. The soup tureen sat in the centre of the table, its silver lid crowned with the Ashbourne stag. Elinor laid the ledger beside it. The sound was small. It silenced the room completely. She turned to her husband. "Your Grace." Ashbourne rose slowly. Elinor opened the ledger to the scorched page and placed one gloved finger beneath the first line. Then she looked at the Duke before 182 guests and said, "Read it aloud." For one dreadful moment, the only sound in the dining room was the faint simmer of soup beneath its silver lid. Ashbourne looked at the line beneath Elinor's finger. Candlelight moved over the page, catching the brown singe at its edge, the ink stain left by Molly's hidden hand, and the cramped figures that had waited in darkness to be believed. He swallowed once, and every guest at that long table seemed to lean toward him without moving. "Read it, Your Grace," Elinor said. His voice came low at first. S. V. London draft. Seal used. Settlement income pledged. A murmur passed down the table. Serafina laughed, but there was no air beneath it. How theatrical. A household note, scorched at the corner, and we are to take it for scripture. Elinor turned the page. No, you are to take it with the coal accounts. She drew out the first sheet and laid it beside the tureen. 20 tons charged for the servants' wing. 10 delivered. The difference paid to an account in London under the initials S. V. Mrs. Bellamy's hand flew to her throat. Lady Morton's fan did not rise this time. Serafina set down her glass carefully. Any steward may make an error. Indeed, Elinor said. So I checked the wine. Another page came down. 6 cases of claret withdrawn for a dinner His Grace never gave. 4 bottles of French brandy marked for medicinal household use, though the still-room had no hartshorn for fainting maids and no proper spirits for poultices. The brandy was delivered to your rooms. Cook, standing near the service door, lowered her eyes. Molly's salver trembled. Ashbourne's face tightened with each word. He did not interrupt her. Elinor placed a third sheet upon the table. Pearls reset. 6 yards of lion's silk. French scent in a blue bottle, marked lavender water for the linen press. Holland cloth ordered for guest beds and cut for travelling trunks. Every charge hidden beneath household expense. Serafina's lips parted. The emerald at her throat rose and fell. You vile little tradesman's daughter, she said. The words struck the room naked. No one laughed. Elinor did not flinch. Yes, my father sold cloth. That is why I know when it has been stolen. A footman near the wall made a sound that might have been a cough, except his eyes shone when Elinor glanced toward him. Serafina turned to Ashbourne. Lucian, will you permit this? Before your guests, before the county. Ashbourne's hand rested on the back of his chair. His knuckles had gone white. Permit what? He asked. My humiliation, Elinor answered before he could. No, your accounting. She opened the ledger wider, letting the guests nearest her see the columns. Numbers did what rank could not. They did not blush. They did not flatter. They stood in black ink and waited. Thomas Reed, she said, dismissed for requesting wages before Michaelmas. Molly Grant, 6 weeks unpaid. 3 footmen in the North Dormer sleeping under frost. Widow Crane marked in arrears after rent was received. Mr. Bell charged twice for grazing rights he paid once in geese and once in coin. A low, ugly sound moved through the room now. Not gossip, recognition. Elinor lifted the printed subscription card from beside Serafina's plate. And tonight, blankets for the poor, coal for widows, soup for children, subscriptions to be collected in the name of charity, printed in the county paper as generosity, then diverted before morning against a private advance due by Friday noon. A gentleman at the lower end of the table pushed back his chair. By God! Serafina's hand shot out and snatched at the card, but Elinor was faster. She held it beyond reach, then placed it in front of Ashbourne. The bailiff waits at the Hare and Crown, she said. If settlement is not made, he returns at morning light. The plate upon this table may be chalk-marked for seizure before breakfast. A lady cried out softly. Someone's spoon fell against porcelain. Serafina's beauty began to fail in pieces. First the smile, then the smoothness of her brow, then the noble softness she wore like borrowed lace. Beneath it stood a woman breathing through her nose, eyes hard, fingers curled as if they longed to tear the page apart. You cannot prove the seal was mine, she said. I need not prove the seal was yours, Elinor replied. I need only prove it was not his. She took up the black wax notice and laid it beside the scorched page. His Grace was at Ashbourne when the undertaking was made in London. Lady Serafina Vale departed for London 2 days before it was executed. Under the name Mrs. Selwyn, initials S. V., she pledged tenant grain, unpaid wages, and income from my marriage settlement against debts concealed in this house. Ashbourne looked at Serafina then, and whatever she found in his face made her step back from the table. Elinor should have stopped there. She did not. She turned one final page in the silver ledger, then faced her husband before all 182 guests. There remains one debt, she said, that Lady Serafina did not steal alone. For one terrible second after Elinor's words, even the candles seemed to bow their flames. Then Serafina moved, not toward the door, as a ruined woman might have done, if ruin had taught her dignity. She moved toward the table, toward the subscription cards, toward the scorched page lying open beside the tureen. Her hand flashed white beneath the lace of her cuff. The silver fruit knife appeared between her fingers, the very knife Molly had named, its narrow blade catching the light like a shard of winter. "Mrs." Harker gasped. A footman stepped forward. Elinor remained where she was. Seraphina seized the page and raised the knife as if paper could be murdered twice. Ashbourne caught her wrist before the blade fell. The room broke into cries then. Lady Morton dropped her fan. Mrs. Bellamy clutched the pearls at her throat. A gentleman swore into his napkin. The footmen surged near the wall, but Elinor lifted one hand, and every one of them stopped. Even then, Seraphina looked not frightened, but furious. "Let go of me," she hissed. Ashbourne's voice came low. "You used my seal." "I used what you left lying about," she spat. "Your seal, your accounts, your wife, your house. You left everything unattended, and then act wounded, because someone else was clever enough to take it." A sound passed through the guests, ugly and eager. Elinor watched Ashbourne's face take the blow. It struck because it was partly true. That was the cruelest thing about a well-placed knife. It did not need to be clean to cut deeply. Seraphina turned toward the room, still held by the Duke. "Do you all mean to pretend innocence? You came here to be seen giving charity, not to see where the money went. You laughed when she was mocked. You dined while servants froze. You wrote your names because the county paper would print them. Do not look at me as if I invented vanity." No one answered. Elinor stepped forward and took the scorched page from Seraphina's hand. The torn edge scratched against her glove. "You are right about one thing," she said. Seraphina's eyes sharpened. This room laughed. The words landed with the memory of that first wound. 182 guests, a mistress smiling in emeralds, a wife left beneath chandeliers, while her own husband did not rise. A decorative wife, a pretty chair no one meant to sit in. Elinor turned slowly so every guest saw her face. "You laughed when Lady Seraphina called me a pretty chair no one meant to sit in," she said. "So tonight you shall watch that chair stand." No one breathed. She turned back to Seraphina. "And you shall watch it hold the house you tried to sell." Ashbourne released Seraphina's wrist only when Burton and 2 footmen came forward. The knife was removed. The subscription cards were gathered under Elinor's instruction and placed before 3 witnesses, the vicar, Lord Morton, and Mrs. Harker, whose hand shook as she signed her name but did not stop. "Every subscription given tonight," Elinor said, "will be delivered directly to the village committee in coin, blankets and coal. The amounts will be printed accurately. No funds will pass through Mr. Hard, Lady Seraphina, or any private account attached to this house." The vicar bent over the list. "I shall attest it, Your Grace." Lord Morton cleared his throat. His face had gone the colour of old linen. "As shall I." Elinor looked at him. "You will also attest that Lady Seraphina attempted to destroy evidence before witnesses." His pen paused. Ashbourne spoke then. "He will." Lord Morton signed. Seraphina laughed once, but it cracked before it became sound. "And what will you do? Have me arrested? Drag a lady before a magistrate because your little maid told a kitchen tale?" Molly stood near the sideboard, pale but steady. Elinor did not look away from Seraphina. "No, I shall send the documents to the creditor, my trustees, and the county magistrate. What they do with forged paper is their office. Forgery was not a fashionable sin. It was not gossip, not impropriety, not a lover's indiscretion hidden behind fans. It was a crime that could end a life at the end of a rope if the law chose to be merciless." The thought reached the room slowly, and when it did, Seraphina's face changed. For the first time, she understood that numbers had teeth. Ashbourne took one step toward Elinor. "I will provide my statement. You will provide payment first," she said. He stopped. "The bailiff returns at dawn. The servants will be paid tonight. The tenant rents will be corrected in the morning. The charity funds will leave this table under seal before any guest leaves this room. Lady Seraphina will return every jewel, every gown, every object purchased by stolen household money, or the list will accompany the magistrate's packet." Seraphina's lips parted. "You cannot strip me in public. You stripped my household in private." The answer was soft, and it struck harder for being so. Ashbourne turned to Burton. "Have Lady Seraphina's trunks brought down." Seraphina stared at him. "Lucian." He flinched at his name in her mouth. Then he looked, not at her beauty, not at the emerald silk, not at the history of his own weakness, but at Elinor, standing beside the ledger with ash on one glove and diamonds at her throat like frost that could cut. "No," he said. "You will address me as your grace." The last of Serafina's power left the room with that title. The room drew in one breath and did not release it. Ashbourne looked at the page Elinor had opened, the one that named no forged seal and no London clerk, only the debt of absence. Household notes written over months in Elinor's own hand, a cold grate in the Duchess's chamber, unanswered letters, servants instructed not to trouble his grace, Serafina seated at his right while Elinor was sent to the far end of her own table, the Duke's signature placed carelessly upon accounts he had not read. His face hardened at first, as pride made one final attempt to stand. "You accuse me of theft?" he asked. "No." Elinor's voice did not rise. "Of absence." The word moved through the dining room more cruelly than accusation. It left no place for rank to hide. Ashbourne looked down at the page again. His thumb brushed one entry, written after the assembly, "Fire laid late in her Grace's rooms." He turned the paper slightly, as if the angle might alter it. "I did not forge the seal," he said. "I know. I did not pledge your settlement. I know. I did not tell Pritchard to withhold wages." "No," Elinor said. "You merely made a house where such orders could live." A chair creaked somewhere down the table. Serafina stood rigid, one hand resting against the linen, as though she might yet command the grain by refusing its judgment. But the guests no longer watched her, not fully. Their eyes had shifted to the Duke, and that was the first punishment society knew how to give a man like Ashbourne. Ashbourne's breath came through his nose, controlled and harsh. "Elinor." She heard her name differently this time, not as a summons, not as a rebuke, as something he had misplaced and found damaged. "The bailiff returns at morning," she said. "Your creditors wait, your servants wait, your tenants wait, and I have waited longer than any of them." Serafina laughed once, sharp and desperate. How touching. The neglected wife makes herself a martyr before supper is cleared. Ashbourne turned on her. The movement was small, but it cut the last ribbon between them. "Enough." Serafina's mouth closed. Ashbourne stepped away from his chair. He looked at the scorched page, the subscription cards, the unpaid wage lists, the black wax notice, and lastly, at the woman he had dressed in diamonds and left in cold rooms. His hand went to the back of his chair again, but this time not to hold power, to keep himself upright. Under the old law, a wife could not easily claim injury against her husband. Her person was folded into his name, her comfort into his discretion, her daily wounds into the private weather of marriage. But a marriage settlement, witnessed and sealed, could still speak when a wife was not meant to. Elinor's father had known that. He had put ink where trust should have been. Ashbourne knew it now too. He moved around the chair and came to stand before her. Then, before 182 guests, before servants who had not been paid, and county ladies who had laughed behind fans, the Duke of Ashbourne went down on one knee beside the ashes of his own house. Serafina made a sound under her breath. Elinor did not step back. She looked down at him, and the old ache did not vanish. It only ceased to command her. "I have wronged you," Ashbourne said. His voice scraped over the words. No polish remained, no ducal ease. "I thought neglect was not cruelty because it required no effort. I let others wound you because I did not wish to be inconvenienced by your pain. I let this house use your money and deny you warmth. I let her sit where my wife should have been honored." He turned his head slightly toward the servants' door. Molly stood there with both hands pressed to the salver. "And I let my people starve within reach of my table." No one spoke, not even Serafina. Elinor looked at him for a long moment. Once, such words might have opened her like rain on dry earth. Now they entered a stronger place and had to wait there for judgment. "Rise, your grace," she said. He did, slowly. "You want forgiveness," she continued. "Begin with arithmetic." His brow drew in. "Every servant restored. Every wage paid. Thomas Reed returned or compensated. Every tenant rent corrected before witnesses. Every stolen shilling replaced from your own purse, not mine. Every creditor answered before the bailiff crosses this threshold at dawn." Ashbourne did not look away. "And Lady Serafina?" he asked. Elinor turned at last toward the woman in emerald silk, whose pearls had begun to look less like adornment than evidence. "She leaves Ashbourne Hall tonight," Elinor said, With nothing bought from this house, Seraphina went pale, Ashbourne's jaw tightened. And if I do all this? Elinor closed the silver ledger and held it against her heart, not as a shield now, but as a verdict. Then tomorrow, she said, I shall decide whether I remain your Duchess, or become the witness who ends you. By midnight, the great dining room no longer resembled a place of celebration. It looked like an office after a storm. Cards were counted, coins were sealed, receipts were written, witnesses signed. Servants moved through the room with plates gone cold and eyes bright with something they dared not yet call relief. Seraphina was led from Ashbourne Hall before the final candle burned down. No pearls, no emerald pendant, no green silk paid from linen money, only a plain cloak, her own gloves, and the sound of carriage wheels grinding over the frozen sweep. Ashbourne watched from the doorway. Elinor did not. She stood beside the table until the last wage packet was sealed and the last stolen sum was entered. When at last she closed the silver ledger, the clasp sounded clean and final. The decorative wife had become the account no one could escape. At dawn, Ashbourne Hall learned what a departing mistress sounded like. Not a grand farewell, not weeping beneath the portico, only the hard snap of trunk lids, the scrape of wheels over frozen gravel, and Lady Seraphina Vale's voice cutting through the morning mist as she argued over a jewel case that no longer belonged to her. The emerald silk had vanished. So had the pearls. She stood wrapped in a travelling cloak borrowed from a maid she had once called clumsy, her face powdered too hastily to hide the red around her eyes. This is theft, she said, clutching the empty case. Elinor stood at the foot of the stairs with the silver ledger in her hands. No, Lady Seraphina, theft is entering pearls as household candles. Ashbourne stood beside her, pale from a sleepless night, and stripped of every easy manner that had once made rooms forgive him. Behind him, Burton held the inventory written before witnesses, jewels purchased from house funds, silk charged to linen, scent charged to the still room, and one silver fruit knife, used to scrape wax from a forged seal. In houses like Ashbourne, movable goods could be listed, marked, and claimed against debt, while land, tied by entail, stood stubbornly, beyond immediate seizure. Seraphina had understood elegance. She had not understood inventory. The bailiff came at 8. He did not chalk the plate. Ashbourne had ridden through the dark to settle the urgent demand with funds raised against his moan, racing horses, and 2 London accounts he had once guarded for pleasure. By noon, Thomas Reed had been sent for. By 3, Cook's wages were paid in full, counted into her hand in bright coin, while she stood speechless beside the kitchen table. Before nightfall, every servant in the hall had been given arrears, not through Pritchard, but under Elinor's eye. Mr. Pritchard was dismissed before the same desk whose drawer she had broken. He bowed stiffly when Ashbourne pronounced it. He bowed lower when Elinor added, "You will leave the rent receipts." His mouth tightened. "Your Grace misunderstands the delicacy of estate management." Elinor opened the silver ledger. "I understand addition." He left without another word. A mistress could be dismissed in an hour. A habit took months to bury. Winter did not soften quickly. The north dormer windows were repaired before the thaw. Coal was delivered to the servants' wing first, and Elinor stood in the yard while the cart was unloaded, her skirts damp at the hem, her gloves grey with coal dust. Widow Crane's arrears were struck from the rent book before the vicar and 2 tenant witnesses. Mr. Bell's grazing account was corrected, and his son received back the geese that had been counted as payment and then quietly stolen into the house books. Still, the house watched Ashbourne. So did Elinor. He no longer entered rooms as if forgiveness waited in them. He knocked upon her sitting-room door. He asked whether she wished to dine. He sent no footman to command her presence. When she answered no, he bowed and left her undisturbed. When she answered yes, he sat opposite her and did not speak of weather, horses, or Parliament until she had finished reading the day's accounts. One evening in March, rain struck the library windows, and the smell of wet earth rose from the open terrace door. Elinor found a small parcel upon her desk. No jewels, no perfume, no silk. A plain brass key lay inside. Ashbourne stood near the shelves, hands behind his back. "The estate office," he said. "There is only one other copy, yours." Elinor lifted it, weighing the metal in her palm. A key is not trust. No, he said. It is a beginning. She looked at him then. The firelight caught silver in his dark hair that she had not noticed before. His face carried lines she had helped carve into it, and he did not ask her to smooth them away. You once called me decorative by your silence, she said. His jaw tightened. I know. Do not court me with remorse, Ashbourne. It spoils quickly. What then? Consistency. He bowed his head. Then I shall be dull with it. For the first time in months, her mouth almost softened. Spring came in mud, lambing cries and damp ledgers. Elinor took her place in the estate office each Thursday. Tenants learned to bring receipts. Servants learned that complaints did not vanish into polished corridors. Ashbourne learned to wait until she had spoken before giving orders. And then, more difficult still, to change his when hers were better. Love did not return like music. It returned, if it returned at all, like a fire built properly. One dry stick, then another, then a guarded flame that had to be fed and watched. Elinor did not warm her hands over promises. She watched conduct. She trusted ink. She kept the key to the estate office on a ribbon inside her gown, close enough to feel against her ribs whenever the house tried to forget. Months later, the snow was gone from Ashbourne Fields, and the first rain of June tapped softly against the library glass. Mrs. Harker brought in a new ledger, bound in blue calf, the silver clasp polished bright. Ashbourne stood beside the desk, but he did not sit in the chair at its head. Elinor opened to the first clean page. The room smelled of beeswax, rain, and fresh ink. She dipped the pen once, steadied the paper with her left hand, and wrote the first name in the new book, not the Duke's, Duchess Elinor of Ashbourne. Only after the ink dried did she pass the pen to him. Thank you for watching the complete story of Elinor, the Duchess who was mocked as decorative and answered with truth, courage, and a silver ledger no one could deny. Her journey was about more than revenge. It was about a woman reclaiming her place, her voice, and the house that tried to erase her. If this story pulled you in, please like the video so the algorithm can help more historical romance lovers find this kind of drama. Share it with someone who enjoys fierce heroines, proud dukes, betrayal, and satisfying reckoning. Subscribe and turn on notifications for the next full story. And tell me in the comments, did Elinor go too far, or did Ashbourne get exactly what he deserved?